is Business Therapy, healing businesses from the inside out through communication and emotional intelligence. I'm Diane Dye Hansen, management consultant, and with me co-host Christine Salvo, therapist, certified mediator, and certified hypnotherapist.
Good morning, everybody. Hello.
Good morning, everybody. And this morning on the show, we have Joshua Wenner, who is an entrepreneur, veteran, filmmaker, and emotional resilience expert. He has spent the last 20 years growing companies, maximizing human potential, and is the founder of Emotional Resilience Training, ERT. His curriculum and frameworks are being used to help first responders, veterans, and professionals who deal with grief, loss, and trauma to reintegrate back into life. The death of his brother inspired him to interview 32 grief and trauma experts to learn more about the messy subject of grief through his documentary, Grief to Grace. The insights he's learned created the foundation for his Emotional Resilience Men's Retreats, a 3.5-day immersive experience designed to provide men and soon-to-be women the space to heal their past traumas and cultivate tools for emotional resilience. The powerful results men received from his retreats led to co-founding K4 with his business partner, Philip Folsom, King of the Four Horses, a global men's community dedicated to helping men become a man in full. In addition, they founded Valor, a comprehensive resiliency and reintegration training program, and work with police, fire, military, and professionals who deal with grief, loss, and trauma. Prior to his work around trauma, Josh spent 20 years in human optimization and personal development. He facilitated over 1,000 peak performance trainings nationwide to groups of 20 to 5,000 while working as a speaker and trainer for Tony Robbins. Welcome to the show, Joshua.
Thank you. Really grateful to be here with both of you today.
Yeah, that was quite a mouthful. There's so much there. I'm like, how do we untangle first? So I have to know. Tell me about working with Tony Robbins.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience. It was truly one of those bucket list items. It's intense. It's a lot of work. The role that I was in, I was a speaker and trainer. So I was on the road permanently with what I did with him, but it was just really fun to be in a powerful culture and get to spend some one-on-one time with Tony. Was amazing.
That's amazing. I've walked on fire. Okay, I definitely did. And my favorite quote afterwards was, "I walked on fire, and it was easy." And then that was the mindset, right? Like, oh, okay. Well, if walking on fire is easy, apparently, I can do anything. And that was rad. Best time ever. I still actually have some permanent friends from that experience. So
that's amazing.
Anything that has to do with that, it was super powerful. So that's really fun. So I have to hear a little bit more now about kind of what started you here. Were you always like, I'm a big fan of personal growth, or what's your origin story?
Yeah, I'd say where it starts, at least for this phase, is I'd say I was a little bit more focused. I'd say I was a little bit more on that warrior side. I grew up in athletics and sports and kind of like more traditional guy, which probably emotionally closed. Hard worker and really focused on getting things done, was very drawn to entrepreneurship. But in order to grow in entrepreneurship, there's a lot of leadership principles. So I would constantly be immersed in leadership. And Tony's really focused on peak performance, which is why I really liked the work with Tony, because it was all about achieving more and growing more, and a lot of mind tools, changing your mind, changing your state, changing your story. So that was that kind of chapter. And it worked really effective with me for most of the losses and challenges that I went through. And then, as Diane mentioned when she read my intro, in 2007, my brother came to see me and said, "Hey man, I've gotten in drugs pretty bad. I now have a heroin addiction and I'm shooting heroin. And if I don't come live with you, I'm going to die. I'm afraid to go back to Reno, which is where I'm from." And I was in Southern California at the time. I had just started a company. I'd moved my partner into my house. I had the credit cards maxed, computers all over the living room. And I'd moved my brother in before. He was also an alcoholic, and I didn't know how to take care of him. And so I kind of looked at both. I was so focused on my quest at the time to create my business. I told him no. And 3 days later, he went back and had a heroin overdose in Reno. And being from a warrior culture that suppressed emotion, I basically put it in a box. I cried when I found out, shoved all that down, came back to Reno, took care of my parents and the service, and then basically put all that in a nice little box and went to go build my company. And we built the company up, and right as we were achieving success, 2008 hit. And then in one swoop, we lost the company, basically in one swoop, I lost my business, my company, my money, and my business partner, and my girlfriend ran off and eloped in Mexico. It was like out of some crazy movie. And so I was standing there in these ashes, and that's when it really kind of hit me like, oh, I chose this over my brother. And that was what led me on my, if you will, hero's journey to try to make peace with something I couldn't fix. Because prior to that, everything else I could quote unquote fix. So I was using fix it tools. And this was the first thing that I couldn't quite fix. Now my brother's gone, and I couldn't fix my own grief and my own shame and my own story around that. So that's what kind of thrust me into the next phase of my work. And that led me down a different route. I initially did the same thing. I did a bunch of plant medicine ceremonies and all kinds of crazy outside the box things to heal, worked with shamans. That's when I also went to work with Tony Robbins as a speaker trainer to learn his tools. And then 6 years ago, I started working with people around grief and loss just because of my own grief. And I couldn't help some of the people that I was trying to help and didn't understand it. And so I started interviewing grief and trauma experts and thinking I was going to help them. Why can't I help them? There's something going on with them. And through that journey, I quickly learned, I was interviewing this man named Ken Druck, who's one of the most loving, amazing men, but powerful, compassionate men, been through a lot of pain. And he works with people on 9/11 and Boston bombings and the families, like really family orientated. And he was the one that introduced the concept of accepting both our brokenness and our wholeness.
Yeah.
And that concept kind of shook me to my core. And that was really the foundation of all the work that I do now. Is I'd spent all my time on fixing things or becoming whole or living in that wholeness. This was the first introduction to accepting, let's call it the brokenness. And it doesn't mean we're broken. It just means when you love deeply, when you fall deeply in love with a dream, a vision, a fantasy, what life's supposed to be, and then you lose it and you can't get it back. There's a deep heartbreak. Yeah. And that heartbreak is a feeling of brokenness. And in learning to equally accept and love and nurture that heartbreak, as much as we love our wholeness, it is actually what gives us peace. So, so that's kind of the foundation of what got me to where I'm at. I started learning tools to heal myself, and that's what bridged forth into doing all the stuff I'm doing now. I started off doing retreats for men. That became highly effective, had some first responders come through, was even more effective with first responders, and that led to developing work and now training and working directly with departments. So that's kind of how the origin kind of reshifted me in another direction. And now the irony is, now I've kind of come back full circle to doing really deep heart-based entrepreneurship, which was my initial vision. My vision was to be an entrepreneur. I just wasn't successful at it the non-traditional way. And then now around my wounding, I've able to turn those into businesses. So it all kind of comes full circle. So I love what you guys are doing around heart-based leadership and entrepreneurship.
That's an incredible story. Thank you so much. And I'm such a vulnerable share. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really interested about what the warrior culture teaches around those things and what you're really battling against when it comes to the, almost, installed way of dealing with pain, with loss, with conflict, with all of these highly charged emotional things. What does the warrior culture teach?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm actually going to go. I am a man, so I self-identify with men in general, and I'd say also I'm going to define it. So I'll unpack a couple things. First, I think it's important to take a look at men in general, and that most all men in our society are lacking a rite of passage. If you look back to my partner is an anthropologist, and so we study a lot of where we came from. And if you look back at tribe culture, it used to be that we were raised in tribes, and the men were taken from their mothers at a young age, and they were given a clear wound, and the wound signified a rite of passage of going from adolescent boy into mature man. And at that same time, you spent 12 to 18 months with a bunch of elders, and you got to spend all this time with men, and they got to teach you through all the men of the tribe what it meant to be a man. And they did that through bringing through stories. And so after this period of time, you were clearly initiated into becoming a man. And when you came back, you now were recognized self-internally as a man, as well as through the tribe. And then when the Industrial Revolution happened, all the men got busy going to work. And so a lot of the men were at home being raised by their mothers. And again, I'm speaking mostly to men because I don't understand the women's perspective in lineage as much as I understand the men's. But what ended up happening is men would see little bits and pieces of their father. And usually when he came home at the end of the day and he was tired or angry or frustrated. And so that's what they got to see is like, oh, a man is this, a man is this. And little by little over time, we're multi-generations of uninitiated men who never really had a rite of passage to step fully into masculinity. And most of the examples men have had are like John Wayne. If you look at the characters, what does John Wayne do? He's a lone wolf that is very stoic, that doesn't show any emotion. And if anything, it's humor or playfulness is the only thing that he shows, or anger are kind of what is acceptable for men. So I think that's helpful too, because just as a man in general, that's one of the things that most men are taught early on. Don't cry, don't show emotion, you're weak, or you're attacked if you are. So you learn quickly to kind of hide or armor up around any type of vulnerability or weakness, because other men will look at a way to attack. When you move that into warrior culture, our viewpoint on warrior culture is honor-based systems is what we call it. An honor-based system like the military or sports teams or athletics. And again, these are both genders. It doesn't have to be only men. Their focus is typically the tribe before the self. So honor-based is service before self, meaning we're only as strong as our unit or as our team. So as a unit, you take care of your brothers and sisters over yourself. So it's honor-based. And that's how you earn credibility in the system, versus most of our society is what we call pride-based. And again, this comes from my business partner, Philip Folsom, in his anthropology work, but pride-based is about self-focused. So that's a lot of the challenges. When you look at a warrior culture, whether it's an athlete, military, or first responder, you're in high stress situations, and the emotions actually do not serve you in those situations. So if I'm on a scene, I'll just give an example of a firefighter. If I show up to a scene and there's multiple fatalities at a scene, and I have to show up and mobilize the situation, and I have to work really quickly and follow protocol, I need to make quick decisions, follow quick protocol to make sure I save somebody's life. If I get into my emotional state and actually feel what's happening, I may be offline. I may get out. I can't actually show up and do my job. So all the training in warrior cultures is to put men and women under high stress. And so when they're in high stress, they will revert to their training. So, but the training requires you to step out of emotion, meaning you disassociate from emotion in order to do your job. The training is very, very, very effective. The challenge is there is never any training to come home.
Yeah.
So, at some point you need to come home to your spouse, or you need to come home to your kids. But if you don't have any training to know how to get back into your emotions, that's where all the problems are massive mental health problems are happening all throughout our society.
Yes. Thank you so much for bringing that up and mentioning that. That's just this is something I'm very passionate about personally. And anytime I get the pleasure of being in front of a man, I'm a therapist, you know that. It's my heart work to help them move through so much of this. And I've worked with many police officers, many firemen, on their trauma, like you said, of like, hey, yeah, you put this on a shelf, but when you sleep or don't, it haunts you. When you're alone or not busy, it haunts you. Your marriage is destroyed because you're not emotionally available, because you can't be, because if you actually drop the armor, you're afraid of what's going to come chasing you. And these poor men and women, but men specifically in a lot of these cases, because women do process, we talk. We will cry. And even as a therapist, I'm in a similar position. I don't, I can't be like, oh, wow, that's the most shocking thing I've ever heard. But later, there's plenty of times where I'll take a bath and cry for hours just for the tragic stories that I hear and that secondary trauma piece. But if I don't take good care of myself and constantly empty that cup, I'm more likely to be in that state too, right? Which is that agitated, irritated, kind of like everybody's on my nerves because I'm not having good self-care. I'm not taking care of my emotional resiliency. I'm not taking care of anything that's going on with me, or even just what I heard, right? Like I am a very visual, I have a great imagination. So you can tell me something, I see it and it's like, oh my God. And so this is such an important topic. And that's really why I was so happy when you accepted, the invitation of, I just feel like there's so much purpose in getting this out.
Well, the irony is it's now proven fact that at least military and first responders, so fire, police, and veteran, the number one cause of death is suicide. It's not line of duty death. So it's that, that they say if you're going to fight monsters, go fight them. Don't wait till they come to the village. They're in the village. Like we're having these problems in our society, and there are tools to navigate it, but it requires new training, new tools, new awareness. And I'd say also, just with now that I'm been deeper and deeper, it started through the lens of grief, of just understanding grief, and it's kind of blossomed into trauma as a more wide. I think now that's what we're going through, even with COVID. Everybody's grieving. They're grieving the way life is. So it's now, everyday people at the hospitals are now becoming under the same pressure of first responders. And a lot of people are going through massive grief. So it's a really relevant topic, I think, for anybody that's at home that's grieving, or in a traumatized state.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you were talking there, Joshua, I really started to ponder my own trauma responses and grief responses. And there was a time in my life where turning off my emotions was necessary for survival. And if for any of our listeners today who are in an abusive relationship, they may identify with the turning off of these processing, these emotions, to just get the day-to-day done. And I was specifically recalling a day where my former husband had punished a pet of mine for peeing inside of the house by chaining her to a tree. And then we left to go to a ball game. And I was crying and kicking and screaming that he did it, but then fell into the moment because, what else was I going to do? There was no control there. And I came back and the dog had strangled herself because there was a thunderstorm and she died.
Oh, God. That's an awful story.
And taking care of that dog because it was a duty to do so. There was no emotion. There was nothing in me. I got the job done. I picked up the dog. I put the dog in the bag. I went to the emergency cremation. I got her cremated that night and took care of everything. And I probably didn't process emotion on that for a few years because it was one of those uncontrollable things. And if you think about the day-to-day of our medical health care workers, our EMTs, our police, our fire, those who are in abusive relationships, male or female, these responses, these non-responses really are a matter of a core survival. So how do you move someone through that core survival where in a highly stressful situation, emotions just shut off into an ability to recognize, wow, I'm actually really shut off here. And I feel like I'm operating, just moving through it to actually being able to process that stuff and process it safely.
Yeah.
It's a great question. And again, it's a little bit different depending on who I'm talking to, but in big piece, I've created different forms of language to help us understand. And I find the first step is just awareness. As you were talking, Diane, like if you think about it, I know that we typically, I think of big T trauma, what they call big T, when we think of what is traumatic or grieving. And a lot of people go like, I don't have any trauma. But when you actually start to really look through the trauma lens, you'll notice there's a lot of little T trauma that I'd say almost everybody has. And it's kind of unaware trauma that we have. But to your point, the way we survive the trauma are the way I look at it is adaptations. And our adaptations or our survival mechanisms is a lot of times even the stuff that we shame. And so the first thing, and it's even in the practice that I teach, is I have a methodology called CPR that I created. And the C stands for conscious awareness. And what that conscious awareness is the first step is, what is the conscious awareness that I'm in I call it an activated state, because it can encompass so much. It can encompass addictions, depression, being busy, cleaning, confused. There's a lot of work from Peter Levine on like fight, flight, freeze, appease, and what happens in our nervous system. Those are all part of being activated, right? So some people fight, some people freeze, some people run or flight. Flight in our society looks like numbing out through TV, avoiding things, alcohol, food, drugs. So I guess sex addiction, all these messy subjects are adaptations to our trauma. And then a lot of times what ends up happening is it's not acceptable in society. So there's a lot of shame. So people tend to hide what they're doing and they blame themselves. So there's a big difference between having first the awareness of that I'm in pain. And so the big phrase that I use, pain, not shame. So if somebody can recognize, anybody that's listening, the next time you recognize yourself shaming yourself, like, and I'll give you one quick story of this, how this applied to me. I had a cat that got really sick, and I deeply love my cats. And I had two brother and sister, and the boy got sick, and it was my first animals. And I was so worried. I was taking him to the hospital, and every day I was driving forever. I ended up spending $7,000, no insurance, over 3 weeks, to give you the extent of how into this I was. And one day I went home, I bought a bottle of wine, a pizza, and a tub of ice cream, and I devoured all of them. And then before I went into my shame spiral of beating myself up, because I teach the work, I was able to go, oh, wait a second, shame, not pain. These are action signals. I'm actually in pain. So I didn't even recognize, because growing up in who I am in my culture, I tend to not be as emotional and not be able to recognize when I am emotional. So for me, the external environment of when I'm doing that is the indicator. So that's the conscious awareness to me that I'm activated. Wow, something's going on. I'm immediately going into get a numbing mechanism. And so that was my oh wait, stop and feel. So the big piece for me, the two phrases are shame, pain, not shame, and feel, not fix. So to lean into that conversation is, I find grief. So I teach 4 levels of emotional trauma, and I won't go through, I got a little bit of time still. So what I'll say is, there's really quickly, because I think this is helpful. Most every human on the planet is going to go through loss over and over again. Life is full of death and rebirth, but in high level, I'll give you the beginning and the end. The first level emotional trauma, think of it as like a little cut on your hand. If you got a little cut, could you ignore it? And you might be fine and it goes away and you don't even notice it again. But think about all the way, one of the most severe is, imagine if you lost your legs. I have a lot of military buddies who've lost their legs in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Like, that is something that you can build a powerful mindset. You can get prosthetics, but there's no fixing that, if that makes sense. So the only way through that is to be really gentle with yourself. And if you notice you have tough days, you get up and you feel that pain and you create a new mindset and you make it through it. So with stage 4, level grief is how I internalize it. There is no fix. So the reason that's important is, when my cat was dying, there wasn't a fix for that. My cat wasn't going to get better. I was in deep pain, grieving something that was now broken, in deep heartbreak. And the only way through that is to feel it. So I find the big piece is conscious awareness that you're in an activated state. Pause. So the CPR is conscious awareness. Second step is pause. And then third step is regulate and feel. And all the top neuroscientists right now, the number one way to regulate your nervous system, the way that you regulate is through what's called activating your vagus nerve. And it's taking a breath of in for a count of 4 and out for a count of 6. And the key to this is the out breath, you'll notice, is longer than the in breath. And what it does is, it's almost like it's a manual pump to regulate your nervous system. You can also do touch, like animals. That's why equestrian therapy is really helpful. Spending time. So I recommend a lot of the men that I work with, when you notice yourself activated, again, it could be a whole number of symptoms, pause and immediately regulate your nervous system. Maybe you go for a walk, spend time with your animals. If you're able to with your spouse, can you establish a touch, maybe holding hands or a form of touch? But there's a lot of ways to start to ground and regulate and come back online. So I know there's a mouthful, but there's it's a pretty wide variety of what maybe people may be going through.
So you say activated. What does activated look like, sound like, feel like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm going to go try to not talk too much about science, but I think it's relevant to understand what's happening with our body. And I'll try to simplify this to make it really easy. But what's basically happening is our brains have evolved for survival and safety. So think of it, what happens is there's a part of your brain. I'm going to hold up my hand and tell you guys what I'm doing if you're listening. So if I held up my hand in a fist and I'm pointing to my arm, let's call the arm my nervous system. And your nervous system looks like a tree. If you had a tree and the roots of a tree, it's connected to everything in your body. So your nervous system is what turns on that. You ever see a cat where the hair stands up? That's their fight or flight response happening. You moved into a fight or flight response. So that sympathetic nervous system is what's called the fight or flight response. And there's a part of your brain, which is called the amygdala, but let's just call it the smoke detector. And it's going to be the part right with your thumb. If your fist is closed with your thumb, that's the smoke detector. And then that's what really is your emotional center. All your fear-based emotions, lust, jealousy, excitement, all those emotions come from there. And right below it, it sits on top of what's called your survival brain. That survival brain is your oldest part of your brain. It's like fight, flight, freeze response, hormone levels, your regulation, your temperatures. It's kind of running the show when you're not conscious. And then the top of your brain is your words and sounds. And the very top, right where if your fist was closed around your thumb, right in the very front, what's called your prefrontal cortex. They call it the watchtower. And this is where compassion, empathy, and executive functioning. So to simplify it, logic, reason, compassion, empathy. So what happens is when you get into an activated state, what happens is the part of your brain that is the smoke detector goes danger, danger, and it sends a signal right to it skips the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that's compassion, empathy, logic, reason, and it sends a signal right to your part of your brain that's survival, that puts you into a fight or flight state, and you flip your top. So if you're watching and you just flip your hand up, what that basically means is it means you lose your capacity for empathy, compassion, and you move into a very narrow mindset of what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight, flight, freeze, appease, which is what your brain is saying is, I'm under danger, get me out of here. And there's very limited decisions. You're in black or white, your hair stands up, it shuts down most of your vital systems like procreation, your heart rate increases, your pupils dilate. So there's a whole physiological response. And then how it used to be in society was, or in the older days, after the threat left, you move back into what's called a parasympathetic state where you come back online, you're now regulated versus unregulated, and then you're back together. So the simplest way to put it is activated means that your body feels danger and it puts you into a fight or flight state and you lose your ability for compassion, empathy, and awareness. How that looks is somebody may move right into eating food or numbing in their certain way, but they're offline. If somebody can really understand that, if you're offline, you have no conscious awareness. You ever talk to somebody and you say you want to do one thing, but your body does the other? That means you're in a hijack state. You're in a body-based response state. Did that help ground it in, Diane?
Absolutely. I think you made it very identifiable for our listeners and understandable as to how that they can identify if they are in a hijack state. So if someone wanted to learn more about what you do, where would they go, Joshua?
Yeah, they could just reach me at joshuawenner.com or on Instagram, Joshua Michael Wenner. It's pretty easy to find me through all the different.
And Wenner, for our listeners, is spelled Wenner.
Correct.
Thank you so much for being on the episode. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, grateful to be here.
Yes, thank you for what you do.
Grateful to be here.
This has been Business Therapy, healing businesses from the inside out through communication and emotional intelligence. I'm Diane Hansen, management consultant.
And I am Christine Salvo, licensed marriage and family therapist, certified mediator, and certified hypnotherapist. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye. This is Business Therapy, healing businesses from the inside out through communication and emotional intelligence. I'm Diane Hansen, management consultant, and with me co-host Christine Salvo, therapist, certified mediator, and certified hypnotherapist.